Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast, where we try to dismantle shame anywhere we can get it. And today we're going to have kind of a shorter episode, but a quick commentary between Jenny Elledge and myself in regards to the new podcast that has been released this last week called Architecture of Abuse, which is addressing systemic issues in regards specifically to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saint, aka the Mormon Church, as far as how they handle child sexual abuse issues. And we just thought we'd have some commentary on that. Hi, Jenny.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Nice to have you. Jenny is one of our providers at Symmetry Counseling, and she is licensed in Florida and Utah and sees a lot of our clients for all kinds of work, couple work, individual work, faith transition work, religious trauma work, sexuality. She's one of our ASECT certified sex therapists at the practice. So she's super helpful in a lot of different ways. And so glad to have you here to talk about this super important topic.
It is important.
Yeah, and I'm one of the people that gets interviewed as part of this project. So I think they said I might be included in episodes 4 or 5 down the road. And I think every few episodes we'll try to give an update of what we're hearing. So I think we'll just turn it over to you. You listened to, I think 2 episodes have dropped, plus what they're calling a deep dive.
Yeah, I heard all 3 of those. Episode 1 follows up with the deep dive, I think, into how the reporting get done. And then 2, so I listened on the road, so I can't remember everything from 2 days ago. I don't remember the format, but yeah, I'm up to date.
Yeah, sounds good. And just so the audience knows, these are not like huge, lengthy podcasts. I think that the main podcast episodes are somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Deep dives are only about 10 or 15 minutes long. So it's definitely a chunkable, workable thing to fit into your podcast schedule. And we highly recommend it. And we'll be putting the links also in the show notes for today's episode. But I guess I want to start out by saying, as I've been listening, there's very little information that I did not necessarily know already, having worked within kind of the system of LDS Family Services and working with so many members of the church and post members of the church. However, there's maybe a few little details that were surprising to me still, or that I think the main thing was just being reminded of things that make me a bit ragey and have been making me ragey for, a long time in my career in regards to helping victims within our faith community. But do you want to share any kind of initial, just overall thoughts as you were listening to this information yourself?
Yeah, I mean, initially, like you, nothing here was super surprising. I've been aware of some of these issues for a while. And I do wonder, however, if there would be new information for the lay public, people who are not therapists or clergy themselves or super aware of any of these issues. This might be surprising to them. I think a lot of this came to light with I think it was an Arizona case that came out a couple of years ago that I think made national news about this too. So maybe more people are aware of this as well.
Yeah. So why don't we just kind of review a few of the things that
the podcast is trying to highlight that are problematic with the systemic way that the LDS Church deals with the reporting aspect of child abuse. So I think you did a little bit of history searching in regards to what mandated reporting is about and how it came about. Do you want to share that information? And then we'll compare how the LDS Church started dealing with this mandate, right? That folks are supposed to be reporting child abuse.
So listening to the podcast made me wonder, well, okay, I know that I'm a mandated reporter. How long has that actually been in existence? It's been a long time, y'all, since I've been in graduate school and having access to this type of information. But hey, we have the internet now, so this is easily foundable. And what we found out is that it was a pediatrician that started to bring about the public awareness to what he called the battered child syndrome. So he made it like a legit thing. That when a child is battered, it sounds like he was focusing on the physical abuse piece. And we know that there's more than just one way to abuse a minor or a child. He made it like a legit thing and had clinical evidence to say that when the children are injured, that this is a serious sign of abuse that is happening, and started to define the phenomenon of child abuse, and then started to include professionals to, meaning his peers, his medical peers, to report suspected cases. And this came about the national concern and therefore the legislative interest in this. So that article came out in 1962, and then by 1963, we start to see the states start to respond to this. And Colorado was the first state to pass a law requiring that physicians report on suspected child abuse, and other states rapidly followed suit. So that by 1967, all 50 states had enacted mandatory reporting laws. So in 1967, we're approaching nearly 60 years that we have had collectively as a society through the states said that we agree. We agree with the idea that medical professionals, when they see suspected child abuse, they should be reporting this. By 1974, we now have federal legislation under the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. And this then provided federal funding to states for CPS or Child Protective Services. It required states to implement mandatory reporting laws in order to receive the funding. And they defined child abuse and neglect for the very first time at the federal level. And then also established the National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect. So since 1974, so that is 45, whatever, math is not my strong suit, 50 years ago, that is how long as a society we have agreed with this idea that minors do not have the ability to advocate for themselves or seek out protective services on their own. They need the help of an adult to be able to do that.
Okay. So that's really helpful to know because we're now in 2025. So we're talking about this process really starting 50 to 60 years ago. So that's a long time. And by all means, the LDS Church has had the time, energy, and resources and monies to be very up to date with these kinds of issues. And I believe it was in 1995 that the church came out with their helpline, right? Which will this podcast definitely starts talking about that much more in depth. And I remember it was President Hinckley who announced the helpline. And the podcast even has a section that gives his presentation of it, which I'm sure was given at a general conference or something like that, describing what this helpline will do. And it's quite disturbing for me, actually. I remember this talk actually being given in 1995. That was the year that I actually started my marriage and family therapy program, and had already gotten my bachelor's degree in psychology from BYU. And so I remember very clearly feeling this sense of like, oh my goodness, wow, this is amazing. I'm so glad that the church is going to have, a space where bishops who are not trained to deal with sexual trauma, bishops who are not trained to deal with, systemic family concerns and issues, and are not trauma informed. Thank goodness they're going to be able to call a helpline, which I had pictured and how it was described would be victim centered, that they would be able to have access to resources and sexual trauma resources. And I just kind of pictured social workers and marriage and family therapists being on the other side of this helpline that would give bishops, good referrals, or, even if it was referrals to LDS family services or counselors in the geographical area and location that these people could be referred to, and that it would coordinate. I never even considered that it would be in lieu of coordination with authorities. I just saw it really as a second step. Like, we have resources to help those people with sexual trauma as a church. But what it ended up being, and what became very starkly clear even back then when I started hearing the stories from my clients and the bishops that I would consult with, is that it really was being given as a direction to both bishops and members of the church to call this helpline first and foremost. That was really the direction that was being given, not as an adjunct to first calling CPS or 911, or, like, okay, we've got a criminal thing here happening. The church is way out of its scope as far as criminal ability to process anything, obviously. And yet that's the direction that bishops were being given, was you call the helpline, and then the helpline will tell you what to do next. So this very quickly in my own mind and experience, even as I was a very believing and practicing LDS person myself, was highly problematic as a therapist, understanding the importance of both mandated reporting and criminal accountability for these kinds of cases. And what ends up happening, and what is very, the lawyer who is kind of one of the main people producing this podcast, is he very clearly states in episode 1, I believe, the questions, or maybe it's episode 2, the questions that the helpline will first ask a bishop.
Mm-hmm.
They're all liability questions. They are all liability questions for the church. They have nothing to do with the victim care. So the question is something like, did the abuse happen on church property? It shouldn't matter where the abuse happened if we're there to help victims, right? So did it happen on church property? That's a legal question. That's not a mental health question, right? There's another question that, like, oh, well, is the perpetrator known to be somebody who is part of the church membership or something like that? Again, nothing to do with the victim care. Again, oh no, what are we going to have to do if this person does happen to be a member of the church or has a leadership position or things of that nature? So there was 3 or 4 questions. I don't remember them all. They were all liability questions that these bishops are getting. And then the church is very good to know in which states what the laws are, and in which countries what the laws are. And basically why the church knows all that is because they want to do the minimum possible according to the law. And there are currently several states still that have this religious privilege protection. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, or what you understand about that?
Well, I don't know all 50 states. I don't have that kind of knowledge, but I was curious since I am licensed in both Florida and Utah, and I live in Florida. I wanted to know if there were any differences when it comes to mandated reporting. So again, remember since 1974, we've had federal legislation that says that we should be there are certain professions that definitely need to be mandated reporters. So since 1974, it has evolved over time, but mandated reporters mean teacher, teachers, school staff, mental health professionals, social workers, law enforcement, and sometimes, depending on the state, maybe even any adult that lives in a universal reporting state and clergy with a caveat, meaning that in some states will have religious privilege exception. So in the state of Florida, we have, let's see, yeah, in the state of Florida, clergy must report any known or suspected abuse of a minor, even if disclosed in confession despite a general confidentiality privilege. In Utah, clergy can optionally report confession abuse and retain immunity, but they're not legally required to do so. However, and this is the part I didn't know about, if abuse is learned another way, they must report. So let's say they witness it, or let's say they hear about it, or maybe, I don't know, a hallway conversation versus a confessional conversation, they should be reporting. That part would be interesting to learn more about. But um, it is interesting that as a society, we have agreed that because we're talking about minor children, meaning people under the age of 18, knowing that they don't have the power, the ability to advocate for themselves, or to even understand that what is happening to them is abuse, that we have agreed socially that we need to protect these people. They're vulnerable. They cannot do this work themselves. They need an adult who's capable to step in and do that. So I don't understand why the church or church A feel like they are the exception here.
Yeah, so this religious privilege protection, I think, goes way back into history, especially like with the Catholic Church and things of that nature, that they wanted a place where people could come and confess their sins and not necessarily have that be reportable to the police, right? So this, I mean, you can look at any mafia movie and you're going to have people, reporting to their priest who they've murdered or things like that. And the priest is not reporting that to criminal law enforcement. So churches in a lot of ways have been given a lot of like sanctuary rights throughout history. And we even see that, now with like illegal immigration, and the churches are like, saying, hey, we are a sanctuary, and whether or not the federal government is trying to change some of those laws, so there's this relationship between church and law has always been historically an interesting medley of agreements, and of course it depends on the country as well, but that still is the case. Like even for therapists, if somebody comes in and reports a crime that they have committed, like murder, like drug related crimes, things of that nature, I don't report that, right? I don't report those kinds of things. Those things are actually protected by confidentiality. The only exception to confidentiality is when a minor or a what we would call a vulnerable adult, which is usually an adult with either a mental disability of some sort, or an adult who is of age, like elderly, and no longer has capacity really to stand up for themselves. So kind of back to your point, Jenny, of who has the capacity to advocate for themselves and to create safety for themselves. A minor doesn't have that, and a vulnerable adult doesn't have that. And that's where the clause to say this is an exception to all the confidentiality clauses is this reporting. Yeah, so churches have historically gotten away even from this mandated reporting of child abuse. Now that has changed, I would say, in the last 20 years. Many states have said even clergy don't get to have that confidentiality exception when it comes to the protection of minors. Utah is not one of those states. They still hold on to their religious privilege protection, which granted makes sense, since I think the legal system and the religious system here in Utah is very intertwined. And therefore, all things that are religious freedom or religious exemptions or religious privilege tend to be stronger in the state of Utah than in other states. I went to Capitol Hill several years ago trying to, lobby and present around some of these issues, and we have not made headway in that regards. And the church is very invested in keeping it that way, right? The church here, because if the church wasn't invested in keeping it that way, I can guarantee you Utah would pass that law like many other states have done. So that is, the church is interested in not being involved in reporting, not being involved in, of course, the liability of the reporting or taking accountability or responsibility for these cases that come up. And the stories start getting really, really wonky and very, very upsetting when you start seeing what ends up happening when the system is set up in this place. I also want to just mention that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints does not do a good job of prevention, right? So for example, there is 0 background checks that I'm aware of. I'm not sure if that has changed recently. I don't think it has. If anybody wants to correct me on that, that's fine. But there's no background checks for people working in the primary program and the nursery programs. And I believe, I don't know about scouting now, if that has changed and we're no longer really affiliated with the scouting program in the ways that we were before. But even the young men's and young women's leaders are not required to have background checks. We have I would say a flimsy 2-person type of protection, like 2 people deep, I think is what they call it, meaning there have to be at least 2 adults at all times in a classroom setting, in a campground setting, and whatever the activities are, so that at least 2 adults can, in a sense, chaperone each other and make sure that they're acting appropriately with minors. And although the church has started to, encourage that, it is not really very strictly enforced. And it's very normal in our lay congregations that it's all volunteer work, that even if there are 2 people in a classroom, one can easily get called out to need, oh, we need your help over here, or we need or your own kid is having issues that you need to attend to, or whatever. And so this 2-person deep policy is not very strictly enforced or even taught or trained on. So those are some of the things. And of course, we don't really have adequate training of our bishops, stake presidents, leaders who work with kids. There's no required training that would specifically have to do with sexual trauma, sexual abuse, that is mandated by people who have these types of jobs within the church community. So the church is failing big time on prevention. The church is failing big time on becoming a trauma-informed religious entity. And then when trauma occurs, the church is focusing primarily on liability for themselves versus protection for the victims. And one thing that I thought was very interesting in both listening to the lawyer, and there's another person that they interview who's a podcaster who actually did a podcast. Do you remember the name of the podcast?
I don't.
Yeah, I'm gonna put that in the notes as well. But it's actually a podcast based on this helpline. And he was not, I don't think he comes from Mormonism himself. And I don't think this one lawyer does either necessarily. So what they say is very shocking to them, and what they find is very shocking to people outside of the church, is that everybody's very confused as to why 911 isn't the first place people are calling. Like, that just makes no common sense to them. Which I think when we're insular to a community, we need to realize that things that may seem normal to us are not necessarily the norm in mainstream land. And of course, I know the church does a big job of saying, well, we shouldn't be like mainstream land, right? We're special and we should be living differently than mainstream land. Well, in this particular case, I disagree heartedly with that.
Yeah.
I think it's very important for members of the church to really sit with that discomfort or congruence of why is it that so many people outside of our community actually think we're kind of bonkers when it comes to how we handle sexual abuse cases to begin with, and that this
Right.
is not so much inspired by God, but inspired by the protective. I always say the LDS Church has huge religious trauma it's never dealt with in regards to protecting itself financially. They almost starved on the way out here. They didn't, they had a lot of financial issues, and also just threat issues of being exterminated and all that. And I think that has left a religious trauma wound that is very self-protective as a church, but not self-protective of the people in the church. And that continues to show itself systemically in how we show up. Any thoughts or comments?
I have a lot of thoughts and comments. Well, first of all, I just starting with the last thing that you said. The church, by the way, have done well for themselves. I don't know if you're aware, but they're fairly wealthy. And they point this out in the podcast. They're richer than the Catholic Church.
We're almost talking Elon Musk level, right? Like, I mean, we're
We're
like,
talking big with the BBB billion, north of 300 billion. And that's what we can kind of figure out with the non-disclosure stuff. So they could live comfortably in perpetuity with never taking another dime from tithing money again. Like they're fine. They have the resources to fund, if you want a very viable helpline that actually helps victims and not protect their own legal butts. They have the ability to do quite a lot of work, quite a lot of good, quite a lot. So I think one of the things that they're asking for this title, which I think is interesting, the architecture of abuse, because it speaks to the structure that is the problem here. The system is the problem here. They could do a lot more and they're choosing not to. I want to point out a couple of caveats. One, when I was a more active member of the church and I was in the Cub Scouts program, I had to, in order to do that calling, I had to go through a training that talked about ways to prevent child abuse from happening and what things needed to be reported. And I actually did, as a parent, needed to report one of the leaders, not because the church was asking me to, but because because of the scouting program, I'm like legally required to report this thing that is happening is not okay. And I got pushback from church leaders for doing that. Like, oh, really? You actually made a call? I'm like, yeah, I made a call. Yes, I did. A, I'm a mandated reporter, and B, I'm a parent. Yeah, I'm going to make a call to that. And it was interesting for me to hear that difference. When my children were going to other churches, I was like, you guys do background checks? That's a standard thing that you do?
yeah.
Huh. I was impressed by that. And I will say that two-person deep thing, that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. They think that because doors have windows on it, that they can circumvent that. I can't tell you how many times I was in a calling all by myself for 6 months before I had any type of partner. It
Yeah.
happened on repeat. It doesn't happen.
I agree with that. And one thing that I want to be very clear about with the audience, and it's really important depending on where you live, to understand the rules of mandated reporting, because now in many states, any adult is considered a mandated reporter. And so what I really want, like people who are attending church and even leaders in the church, bishops, if you're a young women's president, if you're a Relief Society leader, that if you decide to go the church route versus the legal route of your state, you are now in danger of implicating yourself right? And I have heard those kinds of stories where a person followed the church's advice, but then got into legal trouble because their state laws were actually like saying, well, you're a mandated reporter, even just as a community citizen. So don't think that mandated reporters are only professionals. The other thing that was very concerning to me as I heard the lawyer speak, which is he shared that oftentimes church leaders are trying to get out of the reporting themselves. So they will guide the victim to report, or they will guide the parent to report, or they will guide even the perpetrator themselves to report, assuming that then that means they've done their duty. And everything that I have been trained of and everything I understand about mandated reporting is that it doesn't matter. It does not matter if somebody else has reported. If you yourself suspect that abuse has happened, you need to make that call, even if you know that other people have made that call ahead of you. First of all, because you never really know. You never really know. People can tell you they've called and they may or may not have called. And second of all, it adds to the investigation to have more witnesses or more reporting or more ideas about what is actually happening and why this particular person suspects abuse versus this other particular person. If you're a neighbor of a home where there's trauma happening versus the teacher at school, you're going to see different things. You're going to notice different things. And all of that is very useful to the investigation at hand. So when I heard that, I guess that was one of the things that I was surprised to listen in this podcast, is that, bishops are kind of bypassing the mandated reporting by just saying, well, go ahead and report yourself. So that's very difficult. The other thing too is that even though there is this clergy protection in certain states, that does not mean the clergy has to follow that or has to necessarily say, well, they can use that protection, but they don't have to. So that's another thing, is that even if you do have that religious exception, that doesn't mean that you're going to get in trouble if you do report. It just means that you can protect yourself if you don't. So those are the things that were very, very concerning to me to hear. And yes, I think the church is upward to $300 billion, which if you understand how interest works on that, it's hard to even spend the money that you would get on the interest of that. Like, it'd actually be difficult. You'd have to really spend a ton of money to just keep up with the interest that you're receiving. So this idea that we don't have funds, and I know, definitely as a member of the church, the way they talk about tithing and the way they treat funds, and you have to beg and plead for $20 to have an activity days, activity or something. It almost feels like we're all scraping for money, right? And we're all doing our job of counting our nickels and dimes. And so I think sometimes people may have this idea that, well, maybe the church doesn't have the funds to support, or if they faced a class action lawsuit, which is, I believe, what's in the works here, is a class action lawsuit like the Catholic Church had to face over a decade ago now, that they'll be fine. Even with a class action lawsuit, which could be maybe in the $1 to $3 billion category, they will be just fine.
They're going to be 1% of all the assets. Like, they're going to be fine.
Yes. And of course, this leads to, of course, the bigger issue, which for me is always like, if you're going to make the claim, which it's a pretty audacious claim that we speak with God and we get revelation from God. Yeah, I don't think any God is worth worshiping if he's worried about liability and legal issues versus the care and taking on the burdens of the downtrodden and the abused and the vulnerable. So this is another area where the church just does not put its money where its mouth is in regards to how a divine being might want us all to be addressing these kinds of issues. I think we can get into, I know we don't have a ton of time left, but we can get into maybe a few examples of how people, whether we know of them or we've heard of them on this podcast, of how people kind of the nightmare stories that people have had when they go in to confess or to report abuse. Is there anything that comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely one of my very early on clients when I started doing private practice versus working for an agency and therefore working within the church membership was a horrific sexual child abuse story and severe complex PTSD, as one can imagine, from her own father. After doing the actual trauma-informed care, which is complex and long, and then you get to the place of like, okay, can I report like this person to church authority because I'm finding out they are now in leadership positions. They've moved around enough time that they are able to get away with this, I'm a good person and a worthy, upstanding person that can hold this calling. I don't entirely remember what the calling was, but it was something concerning. And it is telling to say that me as a professional, I had to caution my client that if you report to church leaders, which you definitely should do, and then hope for church discipline and hope for maybe an excommunication process, to be cautious about expectations there. Like you may not see what you think should happen. And it turns out that I was correct and the person was not excommunicated.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a really, really common story. This is not a one-off. And
Mm-mm.
that's something that this lawyer is very clear about reporting. Like when he first started taking some of these cases, he thought, oh, well, this must be an exception to the rule, right? And this must be a one-off or a bad apple or a bad bishop. And then after taking on, hundreds of these cases, he's like, yeah, this is not a one-off. This is systemic. This is actually set up to leave bishops very untrained. And one of the things that I noticed him saying, because somebody asked, well, what's going to happen? And he said, it depends on the bishop, which already says there's not a top down like process that they've been trained on. So I think some bishops who have kind of gotten wind of these issues and who are more aware even of their own liability playing that bishop's role is they will include the authorities, they will make those reports, but lots of bishops won't. So again, we've got another way that bishop roulette shows up in our community. Really quickly, there's a question on our Facebook Live, and if there's a class action lawsuit in the works, how does one apply? I will definitely put the numbers for that, and if you listen to the Architecture of Abuse podcast, they also will give you information of how to contact this lawyer in particular to be added.
I just want to, great question. Thank you for that question. I just want to point out when we're talking about the power imbalances, which has been in existence, which is why I think the show is called The Architecture of Abuse, because they're talking about the power imbalances. And remember, as a society, we've agreed that we should be protective of the minors, right? That's been in place for at least 60 plus years. When we're talking about power imbalances and the church having all this money and all of these resources, please remember that we as a people have the power of voice. And this is why we need a podcast like this, because we can collectively, as a unified voice, say $300 billion, we can still take you down.
Yeah. Yeah, and another thing that he said, the lawyer, which was very interesting to hear his language of this, he goes, the church is really putting their own members into this conflict of, are you going to follow the letter of the law, or are you going to follow the word of the Lord? And because the bishops are saying, well, no, do this, follow this repentance program or this forgiveness program, or trust us and trust the help center, when the laws of the land are very clear that you are first and foremost to report to authorities, right? Whether you're a mandated reporter or whether you need help with basically what's happening to you as criminal. And I guess the other thing that I wanted.
Isn't that an article of faith, by the way? We're supposed to obey the law of the land?
It is.
Hmm.
It is. And yet it's interesting how when it comes to our own interests, we can find loopholes around those kinds of ideas. I think the other thing I want to just briefly touch on, which I'm sure this will come up in more episodes, but is again the lack of training that people have around sexual trauma. So, for example, people don't always know when they have been abused. Especially sexually, like in regards to date rape, marital rape, and coercion, even family systems, like where you have a stepfather or a father or some type of family member who is inappropriately touching or accessing a minor's body. For a lot of minors in particular, if this has been their normal, they don't always know. Even if they feel icky about it, they don't have the language or the developmental astuteness to be able to say, I'm being abused. So sometimes somebody will come into a bishop and will say something that sounds like a sexual indiscretion, when in reality, what's really happening is that this person is being abused. And now this person, not only are they a victim of abuse, they're a victim of our worthiness sin kind of categorizing in our church system. And so they're put through a repentance process. And what's really, really just kind of pernicious and evil is that we have not done a good job of retracting comments from prior prophets where in the miracle of forgiveness and during certain general conference talks, certain prophets have said, you, the victim, may share some responsibility for the abuse that you incurred, which is the most asinine, horrific thing that you can say to a trauma victim who we as mental health professionals, that's probably the number one thing that we are trying over a long period of time is to help that person release shame, guilt about having somehow been at fault for a criminal action that has happened towards them. And here the church is actually adding fuel to that fire. And they have never come out publicly and said those statements were actually very misinformed, very wrong. We apologize for the harm that has caused. And this is, how we're going to move forward. So that still percolates with bishops who were trained that way or listen to those talks or stake presidents. And that's we hear so many times, Jenny, this story that I was put through a repentance process because of a date rape or because of something that was happening with my cousin or my dad. And it really blows every brain cell I have. And you'd think that I'd be used to hearing this because I've heard it so many freaking times, and I cannot get used to hearing this, right? This is a systemic issue. Bishops also don't understand how certain mental health diagnoses like PTSD, like certain personality disorders, like bipolar, can affect people's sexuality and their choices and their impulsivity. And again, much of that is trauma informed. Like many of those types of diagnoses develop because of trauma. And so now again, we're punishing people for really a symptom that is part of a mental health disorder, and why we need to get away from this whole worthiness, punishment, confessional type of system to begin with. That is not the role a church should be having. The church should be having a role of ministering, bringing people to Christ, regardless of what their messy lives look like. And that's it. That's their lane. Not this punishing and trying to pretend that they even have a clue as to why certain behaviors show up for people who are dealing with all kinds of trauma, substance dependence, mental health disorders. This is what we mean by not having a trauma-informed lens. Even me, with the 30 years of experience that I have, and all the training and all the continuing CEs that I actually do extra, usually most years, because I'm interested in so many topics, I have a hard time always picking out and assessing, and is what this person is saying really representing what has happened to them, because that person themselves is so wounded that they, as they tell their story, many times they have not come to terms with what has actually happened to them, which is why therapy is a process, right? Why people stay in therapy for anywhere from 3 months to 10 years, solving these kinds of very deep, complicated things. And here we have, a dentist or a plumber or an electrician hearing one little thing and starting some type of repentance program that they have no business being involved in. And the other stories that I hear all the time, and Jenny, I'm sure you can agree, is but be forgiving. Oh, you're the wife of this perpetrator, but stay with him, endure to the end, be forgiving. We'll put him through the repentance process and then he'll get better. Again, with zero understanding of what the treatment is for perpetrators, right? And making especially women stay with abusive people as part of like a forgiveness strategy plan. Anything you want to say about all of that?
Amen and amen. Yes, the trauma-informed thing. I cannot emphasize to you the long-standing harm that, especially, any abuse, but a child. I think you and I both work with adults only, so we don't work with a lot of youth. So we are seeing adults in the 30s and 40s and going, I wonder if this child, abuse thing that I went through might be showing up in my life right now. And it's like, yeah, it is. Like, it's been showing up in your life. You were just kind of calling it something else type of thing. And now we need to really start to take a look at it. This is a long, painful, very intentional, very trauma-informed process that people go through. And I can't tell you how many times I'm like, if only just the perpetrator just didn't, what a different life this person would have had if this thing had not happened. It leaves a mark. It leaves a permanent stain that you can heal from. You can definitely do healing. I'm a big believer in that. But to do that means something happened, something traumatic happened, right? So we're talking about when something traumatic is happening to a child, we can prevent at least the long-standing work that they're going to have to do. We can mitigate that, we can soften it if we catch it early on. Just like a lot of things in our lives, we go to doctors for checkups and maintenance, and if we catch it early on, we're going to do better. If we catch cancer in stage 3, we're not going to do as well. It's the same idea here. We have the means, we have the resources, we can intervene early because early intervention does make a difference.
I do want to second what Jenny is saying, that sexual abuse is going to happen no matter what any church does, but you don't need to be exacerbating and adding to the psychological assault that a lot of church both advice or bishops are doling out, I think many times unintentionally, because they're woefully uninformed and just repeating traditions that no longer serve us. So Patrick says, is there a statute of limitations? What if the abuse happened 30 plus years ago? That's a great question. That does depend by state. And I believe if you have a class action lawsuit, that may also be helpful in that. Many states, Donica says, many states are changing statute of limitations laws because of that. So it does vary by state, but again, these are the reasons why I would encourage you to call the legal staff that Architecture of Abuse is working with. We also talk about a conference talk by Richard Scott, which is where we talked about the victim, some form of responsibility. And also it was taught in the Miracle of Forgiveness and repeated by bishops for decades. So that's the commentary from our listeners, which we always appreciate, fact checks or resources or things like that. Okay, so that's our first little smackdown on what's happening with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, aka the Mormon Church, in regards to their woeful ways of managing child abuse cases, sexual abuse cases in particular, And we really encourage you all to go look at the architectureofabuse.com website, where they are dropping some of these episodes. They're easy to listen to. They explain things very clearly. They're short. They're on the shorter end. And let's really, I mean, I think the goal here is like, let's really gather as a community, whether you're a believing member, whether you're a nuanced member, whether you're a post member, we all care deeply about the safety of minors in particular in the LDS Church, as well as adults who've grown up in this system, as well as people who are being given really, really harmful advice, because we want healing and well-being. And if that's not at the basis of the gospel of Jesus Christ, as we understand it through an LDS lens, then I don't know what the hell we're talking about. So with that, we will leave you all for today. Thank you, Jenny, for joining me. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki say the namo, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. Years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. No dishki shade so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland.